So you give a crucial importance to a specific version of scrutability in your book, a priori scrutability. But you don't specify what you mean exactly by a priori knowledge, or what account of a priori knowledge you endorse. And could you tell us what is the account of a priori knowledge you have in mind that you're most sympathetic to? Or some account roughly centered on the nature of understanding, on conceptual content and inferential relations would fit with your view? Is that right? An account a la Peacock, perhaps, or an account grounded in some version of conceptual role semantics? So what do you think of more exotic account of a priori knowledge? Maybe, for instance, those based on epistemic role of rational insight or intuition, such as Bonjour's.
I don't have a positive theory of a priori knowledge, how it is that we have a priori knowledge. In fact, I don't have a positive theory of any knowledge. I don't have a good account of how it is we have perceptual knowledge or empirical knowledge in general. I guess I have something of one paper I talk about how we have introspective knowledge. That's as far as I've gotten. So, nonetheless, I'm confident that we have a priori knowledge. I mean, I think it's very plausible we have knowledge in logic and mathematics, and very plausible that knowledge is not essentially grounded in experience, perceptual experience of the external world, and so on. So I think it's very plausible that we have a priori knowledge, and in the book I try to make clear what I mean by a priori knowledge not essentially justified by experience, and to defend a priori knowledge from various challenges, most notably Quine's challenge in Two Dogmas of Empiricism. I try to argue that this argument doesn't succeed in making a good case against a priori knowledge. That said, I still don't have a positive account to give. If you're asking me to speculate what positive account would I be most sympathetic to, you mentioned understanding-based accounts. I guess I'm inclined to think understanding-based accounts have some role to play, especially when it comes to what we think of as the analytic a priori. All bachelors or unmarried, perhaps, or all Australians are from Australia. But I do think there's a priori knowledge that goes beyond that. I think that for mathematical knowledge, for example, I don't think the understanding-based approach is sufficient. So, what's the correct account of mathematical knowledge? Well, I don't really have such an account to give. I'm not unsympathetic with accounts in virtue of to give a role to rational intuition. Maybe there's some sense in which when we recognize the truth of the axioms, some kind of intuition is involved. But maybe also that, that some further more basic accounts is required. I think it's, basically, for the analytic, the thought is that for the analytic truths, concepts do most of the work. Concepts and understanding do most of the work. Whereas for things like you might think of as synthetic a priori, like mathematics, then thinking and reasoning is doing more of the work. Exactly what's involved in the fundamental sources of justification in thinking and reasoning, I really don't know. But I'm open to the idea that something like intuition is at least part of those sources.
You claim that although part of the hard cases, there are truths such as phenomenal truth, which are derivable from the scrutability thesis, from the scrutability base, and can be accommodated within a scrutability framework. So you would have to say that in the scrutability base there is some kind of information which tells us what it means to be, what it's like to be a bat. Would you grant that such a piece of information exists, and how could it be implemented within a cosmoscope?
Yeah, well, PQTI, as I understand it, has complete all the phenomenal truths about the world, which will include truths about what it's like to be every conscious subject, so humans and bats and others. So insofar as there are truths about what it's like to be a bat, those truths will be in PQTI. Now, how is the cosmoscope going to give you those? Well, the thought is the cosmoscope will give you an imaginative recreation of what it's like to be a bat. Maybe you won't actually have the bat's experiences directly, but at least enable you to imagine them. Now, this might require some kind of idealization. Maybe with our brains, we can't do this. We're going to need to imagine an idealized version ourselves, it's in a position to have all these concepts. One of the relevant idealizations is idealizing our ability to possess concepts that we can't currently possess. But if we could have the concept of what it's like to be about, then we could come to imagine this and so on. If we could do all this, if the cosmoscope gave me access to what it's like to be about, to what it's like to be you, and so on, all this phenomenology, as well as to all the facts about the functioning of your brain and your behavior, then I think it's not so implausible that truths about your feelings and your intentions and so on will be scrutable from there.
All right, so let's move to the idea in the book that it's interesting also to come to know how small the scrutability base can be. So what is your strategy to make the scrutability base as small as possible? And what are the main obstacles to such a procedure? Why is it desiderata to keep the base as small as possible?
Historically, certainly, Carnap's project was to deal with a very austere base, logic plus the phenomenal. So, for that sort of historical inspiration, there's a lot to be said for a small base. But I also think it's quite, and much of the intrinsic interest of the project comes from having a small base. After all, if we allowed the base to be arbitrarily large, then the thesis would be trivially true, because all truths are clearly scrutable from the class of all truths, or maybe we could say it's the class of all atomic truths. Conjunctive and disjunctive truth would be scrutable from there. Not terribly interesting. So for the thesis to be interesting, the thesis has to be small, and that's precisely where it gets to be controversial. So we don't want expressions like hand to be in the scrutability base, or cup, or table, or Sebastiano, or Italy. The thought is they should be scrutable from more basic elements. And this actually matters for a number of the applications. One application that especially matters for is for applications in the philosophy of language, where I use scrutability to construct intentions, roughly ways of applying our terms to different epistemically possible scenarios based on scrutability. Take the term water. Well, if our world is this way, if PQTI like this, then we say water picks out H2O, right? Water is H2O is scrutable from PQTI. But if it had turned out to be a different way, the way it works on Putnam's twin Earth, PQTI star had turned out to be true, then we would have said water is XYZ. Also, water is XYZ turns out to be scrutable from PQTI star. So what this brings out is that water has a non-trivial intention in this world, but this requires that water not be in the base. If water was just in the scrutability base, it wouldn't get a terribly interesting intention at all. Water would pick up whatever the scrutability base says that water is, and this would end up being more or less trivializing the semantic project. So I think it's quite important that we have a relatively austere basis, so that we get to have interesting substantive intentions for these expressions like water that have an interesting behavior across epistemically possible scenarios. Likewise, also for motivating some of the other projects, like for using this to define up a kind of narrow content which is only in the head. It's important we have an austere, a special kind of base of expressions that are subject to Putnam's twin Earth style thought experiments involving, like the one involving water, where the term has one referent in one environment and a corresponding term used by a duplicate has a different term in a different environment. If I can bring it down to just having narrow and non-twin earthable expressions at the base, I can use this to define up narrow content. That really does. And it is really important that the base is constrained in different ways. Now, slightly different constraints are going to matter for different purposes. In this case, it's the narrowness. For other purposes, it may be for some metaphysical projects. It may be a matter of only having metaphysically fundamental things in the base. And it may turn out that some philosophers are going to be willing to go along with scrutability theses that invoke one class of constraints but not the other. But I think at the end of the day, it's going to be the constraints on the base that do a whole lot of the work.